The tray slipped from her hands before she could stop it, and the sound it made was sharp enough to cut the air in half. Crystal exploded against marble like a gunshot. The room froze. Every voice died at once, like someone had pulled the plug on sound itself, and all that remained was the echo of glass skidding across the floor. For one long second, nobody moved. Then every eye turned to her. She didn't gasp, she didn't curse, she didn't look around for help. She lowered herself to the floor immediately, knees pressing into the cold marble, fingers moving fast and careful as she began picking up pieces that glittered under the chandelier light. Her breathing stayed even, controlled, like she'd practiced this moment in her head long before it happened. The smell of expensive wine hung heavy in the air, the kind that costs more than some people's rent. It soaked into the hem of her blue jeans, darkening the faded denim. She didn't react to that either. She wore a dark t-shirt, soft from too many washes, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, no logo, no jewelry, nothing that begged for attention. Next to her, women floated by in silk dresses that whispered when they moved. Men stood tall in tailored suits that fit like armor. Watches glinted, shoes shined, status radiated from every corner of the room. Her clothes spoke before she ever could. To them, they said everything. She was nobody. A shadow passed over her, blocking the light. She looked up just enough to see polished shoes planted inches from her hands. The billionaire host didn't crouch or lean down. He didn't need to. Power never does. His mouth tightened, not in anger, but in something colder. Disgust mixed with boredom. "Careful," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. "You're not at home." The words landed harder than the glass had. A few people laughed. Not openly, not boldly, just enough to let her know they heard him, just enough to let her know they agreed. It was the kind of laughter that hides behind wine glasses and turned shoulders, the kind that thinks it's harmless because it's quiet, the kind that bruises without leaving marks. She kept her head down. Her fingers trembled once as she gathered a jagged shard and placed it neatly on the tray. She didn't look at the man again. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. Silence was safer. Silence always had been. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. Not tonight, not here. When she'd arrived at the estate earlier that evening, the sky had been soft and pink, the kind of sunset that makes even big houses look gentle. The gate had opened slowly, deliberately, as if it were deciding whether she belonged. The assistant met her at the door with a tight smile and a clipboard pressed to her chest. "You're here to help," the assistant had said, not asking, just stating. "We'll need you moving all night. Trays, refills, cleanups. Don't wander, don't interrupt. If someone speaks to you, be polite, otherwise stay out of the way. No name on the list, no chair, no introduction, just help." She'd nodded then, too, calm, composed, like this was normal, like being erased was just another role she knew how to play. Now, on her knees, she felt the heat rise up her neck as whispers floated above her. "Do they let anyone in these days?" a woman murmured, not even bothering to lower her voice all the way. Another voice followed, amused. "Guess standards are slipping." Someone's shoe brushed past her hand. They didn't stop. They didn't say, "Excuse me." She shifted to avoid getting stepped on, glass biting lightly into her palm. A thin line of red appeared, bright against her skin. She pressed her fingers together to stop the bleeding and kept going. Her face burned, but not from the cut. She focused on the floor, on the reflection of the chandelier fractured in 1,000 tiny shards, on breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth, slow and steady. She had learned long ago that reacting only gave people more to take from you. Across the room, conversations restarted in pieces, like engines turning over. Deals resumed, laughter returned, music hummed softly from hidden speakers. To them, the moment was already over. To her, it stretched. She finished collecting the glass and stood, tray balanced carefully in her hands. A man she didn't recognize gestured toward his shoes, wine darkening the leather. "You missed some," he said, like he was pointing out a smudge on a window. She knelt again without a word and wiped the wine away. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished shoe. Calm eyes, set jaw, no tears. That seemed to bother him more than if she'd cried. People like him expected something: anger, shame, gratitude, anything that confirmed the story they'd already written about you. She gave him nothing. As she moved through the room again, refilling glasses, clearing plates, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Not curiosity, judgment, measuring glances that added her up and found her lacking. Every step reminded her how alone she was in a room full of people. Near the bar, a group of black servers stood together, dressed in matching uniforms. Crisp, professional. They watched her quietly. One of them met her eyes for half a second. In that glance, she saw recognition. Not pity, understanding. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how a room like this works. She looked away first. The billionaire host watched her now, too. Not openly, not like before. There was something different in his gaze. A crease in his brow, as if a detail didn't quite fit. As if the way she carried herself didn't match the role she'd been given. People who are small rush to explain themselves. They apologize too much, they fidget, they shrink. She didn't. She moved like someone who belonged somewhere else. That unsettled him. Who brought her? He asked his assistant quietly, eyes still on her. The assistant flipped through the clipboard, confusion flashing across her face. She was told to come early. I thought what? He snapped. The assistant swallowed. I thought she was part of the staff. His jaw tightened. He waved the question away, but his eyes stayed locked on her back as she crossed the room. Power doesn't like uncertainty. It likes labels, boxes, clear lines. She blurred those lines just by standing there. As the night wore on, the demands grew sharper, voices louder, commands less polite. Someone snapped their fingers at her like she was a dog. Another waved her over without looking at her face. She obeyed every instruction, but something subtle shifted. Her shoulders straightened. Her steps slowed just a fraction. Not enough to be called defiance, just enough to be felt. It made people uncomfortable. A woman in a diamond necklace leaned close to her as she passed. You should smile more, she whispered. People like that. She met the woman's eyes then, just briefly. There was no smile, no glare, just a steady look that lasted a beat too long. The woman recoiled slightly, frowning, unsure why she suddenly felt exposed. She turned away. Inside, memory stirred. Not of rooms like this, but of boardrooms, of quiet offices where decisions were made without raised voices, of being listened to, of being known. She pushed them down. Not yet. The music shifted to something softer. The crowd gathered closer together. Someone clinked a glass, calling for attention. The billionaire host stepped forward, smiling wide now, every inch the gracious man the world knew him to be. As he spoke about generosity and opportunity, she stood at the edge of the room holding a tray, her arm aching slightly. His words floated over her head like smoke. Beautiful. Empty. She watched faces light up at the sound of his voice. Admiration, respect, gratitude. She wondered how many of them would still smile if they knew. Her grip tightened on the tray. When his speech ended, applause filled the room. Loud, earnest, people stood, glasses raised, celebration surged. And still, nobody looked at her. That was the hardest part. Not the laughter, not the comments, the erasure. The way a room could be so full and still make you feel visible. She turned toward the hallway, ready to take the empty glasses back when her foot caught on something slick. The tray tilted. Time slowed. The crash came again. Silence followed again. This time she didn't move right away. The room waited, held its breath. Curious now, annoyed, expectant. She looked up slowly, meeting the billionaire host's eyes across the floor. Something unspoken passed between them. A challenge he didn't realize he'd issued. A promise she hadn't yet kept. She lowered herself to the floor once more, gathering the glass, calm as ever. But inside, a decision settled into place. They thought this night was about money, about status, about who stood where and who served whom. They were wrong. This night was about truth, about what people reveal when they think no one important is watching. And the silence pressing down on the room wasn't her breaking point. It was the quiet right before the world tilted, before names mattered, before power shifted, before they learned exactly who she was. And as she rose to her feet again, tray in hand, eyes steady, the tension lingered in the air, thick and unfinished, waiting for what was coming next. They kept her moving without ever learning her name, without ever meeting her eyes, without ever asking if she could breathe. Refill this, carry that, clean up faster. The words came like taps on glass, sharp and careless, each one landing with the confidence of people who believed the room belonged to them. She moved because stopping would have invited questions, and questions were never meant for people like her. Every command sharpened the imbalance hanging in the air. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Power never raises its voice when it assumes obedience. The room was full of men and women who spoke in numbers, who laughed about deals worth more than whole neighborhoods, who talked about influence the way farmers talk about land. They talked about people like her as if she were a concept, not a person. Labor, help, background. She stood inches away from their conversations, close enough to hear every word, invisible enough to be forgotten the moment she stepped aside. One man snapped his fingers without even turning around. The sound cut through her chest. "Miss," he said, pointing vaguely at the floor with his shoe. "You missed a spot." His tone wasn't angry. It was bored. That hurt more. She looked down. The marble reflected the lights perfectly. There was nothing there. Still, she bent her knees and lowered herself again, cloth in hand, wiping an already clean surface. Her back curved. Her head dipped. To anyone watching, it would have looked like surrender. It wasn't. It was strategy. Not because she was weak, not because she believed she belonged on the floor, but because she understood something they never had to learn. Power loves obedience. It feeds on it. But it never respects it. Respect only comes when obedience ends. And tonight, obedience was the mask she wore until the moment she chose to remove it. Someone near the bar asked where she was from. The question floated toward her, casual, curious, like it didn't matter much either way. She opened her mouth to answer. Before a single word could leave her lips, another voice cut through, louder, sharper, laughing. "Does it matter?" The laughter that followed was quicker this time, less hesitant. It rolled easily across the room, catching others and pulling them in. She felt it brush against her like a cold wind. Her hands tightened around the cloth. For a split second, her fingers shook, not from fear, from restraint, from holding back 1,000 words that deserved air. She swallowed them all. She remembered why she came. The promise she made to herself while standing in front of the mirror hours earlier. Not tonight. Not yet. She had repeated it like a prayer. Not tonight. Not yet. Timing mattered. Truth without timing was just noise, and she had learned long ago how quickly noise gets ignored. Across the room, the host watched her more openly now. His eyes followed her movements as she passed between guests. There was no anger in his face anymore, no open disgust. What replaced it was suspicion, a quiet frown, a sense that something wasn't lining up. Something about her calm didn't fit the story he had already written about her. People in service roles were supposed to rush, to smile too hard, to apologize too fast. They were supposed to shrink under pressure. She didn't. People who are truly small rush to defend themselves. They explain, they justify, they beg to be understood. She didn't do any of that. She moved slower now, not enough to be noticed, but enough to feel. Her shoulders rolled back, her chin lifted just slightly. She stood straighter even when she was holding a tray heavier than it needed to be. Silent, grounded, waiting. That silence unsettled them more than anger ever could. It forced them to look, to notice, to wonder. Confidence without permission is dangerous. It doesn't ask for approval. It doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, and that alone can feel like a threat to people who are used to being above question. A woman brushed past her, muttering something about incompetence under her breath. Another guest waved her away impatiently, annoyed she hadn't appeared fast enough. Each small moment stacked on the next, building a weight that pressed down on the room. The injustice thickened. It became something you could almost taste, sharp and bitter at the back of the throat. She felt it too. She felt every look, every whisper, every careless word. She cataloged them quietly, not out of spite, but out of clarity. This was who they were when they thought no one important was watching. This was how easily dignity slipped when power felt safe. Near the edge of the room, she caught sight of one of the staff again. A young black man in a pressed uniform, eyes steady, face unreadable. Their gazes met for a brief second. In that moment, there was no hierarchy, no roles, just recognition. He knew this space. He knew its rules and its traps. He had survived it by learning when to disappear and when to stand firm. He gave her the smallest nod. Solidarity without words. She nodded back. The music shifted low and smooth, filling the gaps between conversations. Glasses clinked. Deals continued. The night rolled on as if nothing was wrong. But something had changed. The room felt tighter, smaller, like walls inching closer without anyone noticing. The host leaned toward one of his guests, whispering something while keeping his eyes on her. The guest glanced at her, then away, uncomfortable. A ripple of unease passed through their circle. Power senses disruption the way animals sense weather. They didn't know what was coming, they just knew. Something was. She passed by a table where men debated philanthropy, talking about lifting communities they had never stepped into. Their words were smooth, practiced, empty. She set down fresh drinks without a sound. None of them paused. None of them thanked her. One of them rested his hand on her tray a beat too long, as if testing how much space he could take. She didn't flinch. Inside, memories pressed forward. Not of nights like this, but of long days spent building something real. Of rooms where her voice had weight. Of moments when silence wasn't forced on her but chosen. She pushed those memories down again, held them back like breath underwater. Not yet. Another command came from across the room, sharper now. Hey, over here, no please, no eye contact, just expectation. She turned and walked toward it, steps even, face calm. Each step felt heavier, not because of the work, but because of the waiting. The tension drew tight enough to hum. They thought they were breaking her, thought each order chipped away at her worth, thought each dismissal reinforced the story they told themselves about who mattered and who didn't. They mistook her silence for submission, mistook her restraint for weakness. They were wrong. What they were really doing was sharpening her. Every slight honed her focus. Every laugh clarified her resolve. Every glance reminded her why she couldn't rush this moment, why she had to let them reveal themselves fully before she revealed anything at all. The host's suspicion deepened. He watched her speak politely to a guest who had just insulted her, watched her accept criticism without shrinking, watched her carry herself like someone who understood her own value even when no one else did. It bothered him. It gnawed at him. He didn't know why. The room grew louder, but the space around her felt eerily quiet, like the eye of a storm. She stood there, tray balanced, breath steady, eyes forward, waiting. Because the moment she'd been preparing for was getting closer. She could feel it in the way conversations faltered when she passed, in the way laughter came a second too late, in the way the host's gaze lingered longer than it should have. The injustice had reached its peak. The silence had become a cage, and she stood inside it, unbroken, patient, ready. They still believed they held all the power. They still believed this night belonged to them. They had no idea how close they were to learning the truth. And as she turned toward the center of the room once more, the air thick with expectation, the tension held, unspoken and heavy, waiting to snap. The assistant arrived late, breathless, pushing through the tall doors like someone who had been running from something they couldn't name. Her heels clicked too fast against the marble, the sound sharp in a room already tight with tension. She clutched her clipboard like it might steady her hands, but it didn't. Her face was pale, eyes wide, scanning the crowd with urgency instead of pride. She was looking for someone. Her gaze swept past the chandeliers, past the smiling donors, past the billionaire host holding court near the center of the room. Then her eyes landed on the woman in the dark t-shirt and blue jeans. The woman standing still, empty-handed now, shoulders squared, calm in a way that didn't belong to someone who had been ordered around all night. The assistant froze. Time seemed to pause right there. Music faded into a low hum. Conversations thinned out, words dropping into silence one by one. The assistant's mouth opened, but for a second nothing came out. When she finally spoke, it was barely louder than a breath. Oh my God. The host turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face. He didn't like interruptions, especially not ones that pulled attention away from him. What is it? He asked, voice clipped, already annoyed. The assistant swallowed hard. The sound carried. Too loud in the quiet. Heads turned. People leaned in without meaning to. Something in her expression told them this wasn't small. She's not staff, the assistant said. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed heavy and final, like a door slamming shut. Silence slammed into the room. Not the soft silence of polite listening. Not the awkward pause before laughter. This was different. This was the kind of silence that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. The kind that presses against your ears until you feel it in your chest. Every eye turned toward the woman who had spent the night being ignored. She straightened fully for the first time. No tray in her hands, no rag, no glass, just herself. Her dark t-shirt hung loose against her frame. Her blue jeans were marked with faint stains from spilled wine. She looked exactly the same as she had moments before, and yet everything about her had changed. "I never said I was," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, not defensive, not proud, just true. The host let out a short laugh, sharp and thin. It sounded wrong even to his own ears. "Then who are you?" he asked, trying to smile, trying to pull the moment back into something he could control. She met his eyes. There was no anger in her face, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass him the way she could have. What looked back at him was something far more unsettling. Clarity, certainty, truth that didn't need to shout. "My name is Eleanor Wright," she said. The name moved through the room like a current, "and I own the foundation funding this entire event." The air vanished. It felt like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. Faces drained of color, glasses froze halfway to mouths. A woman gasped without sound. A man's laugh died in his throat. Power shifted so fast it made people dizzy. Eleanor didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it do its work. People replayed the night in their minds at lightning speed. The snapped fingers, the jokes, the looks, the way they had spoken about people like her while she stood right there. Every careless moment came rushing back, sharp and unforgiving. She continued, her voice softer now but no less steady, "And I came dressed like this on purpose." Something broke then, not loudly, quietly, inside the room, understanding spread across faces like a slow, painful dawn. This hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a name tag missing or a bad assumption made once. They hadn't misjudged her by accident. They had revealed themselves by choice. The host stepped forward, hands raised slightly, as if approaching a wild animal he had just realized could bite. "Ms. Wright, I had no idea," he said quickly, too quickly. "If I had known—" "You did know," she said gently. The words stopped him cold. "You knew who I was the moment you decided how to treat me," she continued. "You just didn't think it mattered." Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone set a glass down with shaking fingers. Another guest avoided looking at her altogether, eyes fixed on the floor where she had knelt earlier. The host's face flushed. Apologies poured out now, one on top of another. Too loud, too rushed. Each one sounded less sincere than the last. "This is unacceptable. I take full responsibility. This will never happen again. Please, let me make this right." Eleanor listened without reacting. She didn't nod. She didn't interrupt. She didn't smile. When he finally ran out of words, the silence returned. "Tonight," she said, her voice carrying easily, "you showed me exactly how you treat people you think can't answer back." The words cut deeper than any insult could have. They weren't cruel. They were honest. She looked around the room slowly, meeting eyes that had avoided her all night. "You spoke about dignity," she said, "about community, about lifting others up." Her gaze settled briefly on the host again. "But dignity isn't something you donate. It's something you practice." No one argued. Somewhere near the back, one of the black servers straightened. Another lifted their chin. Recognition passed between them, quiet and powerful. This wasn't just her moment. It was theirs too. The host tried again, his voice lower now. "What can we do?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head slightly. "This isn't about what you can do for me," she said. "It's about what you've already done." She turned then, her movement unhurried, and looked directly at the staff lined along the wall. People who had been invisible minutes earlier. People whose names were rarely learned, whose voices were rarely heard. "This," she said, gesturing toward them, "is who made tonight possible." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Applause threatened to start, then died before it could take shape. No one knew what the right response was anymore. That was the point. The room didn't belong to the loudest voice now. It belonged to the truth sitting in the space between them all. Eleanor took a step back, giving the host room again, but the power didn't return to him. It lingered with her, steady and unmovable. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded respect. She had simply named what was already there. Dignity reclaimed the room not with force but with presence. As conversations tried to restart, they came out different. Softer, careful, people laughed less, looked longer, thought twice before speaking. The night would go on, but it would never be the same. And as Eleanor stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes clear, the tension didn't fade completely. It stayed coiled and waiting. Because while the truth had been spoken, the lesson had not yet been finished. She didn't humiliate them back, and that choice landed heavier than any speech ever could. The room waited for it, for the sharp turn, for the moment when power flipped and she pressed down the way they had pressed down on her. Some people even braced themselves, half expecting her to point, to name, to expose each face one by one. That was how these stories usually went. That was what made people feel safe again. Punishment, balance, revenge dressed up as justice. But she didn't give them that. That was the final lesson, and it arrived quietly. When the host gestured toward the stage, offering her the microphone with a smile that still trembled at the edges, she shook her head. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to be clear. The spotlight hovered for a second, unsure where to land, then dimmed slightly as if embarrassed. "I'm not here for that," she said. Her voice didn't carry anger. It carried weight. She didn't want applause, didn't want praise for surviving something she never should have been put through. She had seen too many rooms clap for the wrong reasons. Too many people confuse being impressed with being changed. Instead, she turned the conversation where it belonged. She spoke about workers, about hands that lifted and cleaned and served without names being learned, about people whose dignity was treated like an optional detail. She redirected the donations away from vanity projects and into programs that protected labor, supported families, and restored something simple and powerful to people who had been taught to live without it. Respect. There was no big announcement, no dramatic reveal on a screen, just a few sentences spoken calmly, firmly, like facts that had always been true, whether anyone liked them or not. Some guests nodded quickly, eager to agree now. Others looked down, wrestling with something uncomfortable rising in their chest. A few stared straight ahead, faces tight, trying not to feel exposed. Change never moves through a room evenly. It settles where it can. The billionaire host stood beside her, quieter than anyone had ever seen him. When he finally reached out his hand, it wasn't for show. It was hesitant, human. He waited. She paused. That pause mattered. It stretched long enough for everyone to feel it, long enough for him to understand that this wasn't a gesture owed to him. That forgiveness, like respect, wasn't automatic. It had to be chosen. Then she took his hand. "Power," she said quietly, so quietly people leaned in without realizing it, "isn't proven by who serves you. It's revealed by how you treat them." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled. He nodded once. Not in agreement, but in recognition. Something in him had cracked open. The performance was gone. What stood there now was a man seeing himself clearly for the first time in a long while. Broken, yes, but changed in the way that matters. The way that doesn't rush to fix things but commits to not repeating them. Around them, the room breathed again. Conversations restarted, but they sounded different now, softer, slower, less sure of themselves. People watched the staff more closely. Not out of guilt alone, but curiosity. Humanity re-entering the frame. Eleanor stepped back, giving the space away. She didn't linger, didn't circle for thanks. She gathered her jacket from a chair near the wall, the same chair she hadn't been allowed to sit in earlier. No one stopped her. No one tried to hold her there with praise. She left the room the same way she had entered it. Dark t-shirt, blue jeans, head high. No applause followed her footsteps down the hall. No one called her name. There was no send-off, no music swelling to mark the moment. Just the quiet sound of a door opening and closing, and then the low hum of a room left behind to reckon with itself. That silence did more work than noise ever could. Inside the room, people stayed where they were for a moment longer than necessary. Glasses rested untouched. Smiles didn't quite return. Each person was left alone with their thoughts, replaying small moments they wished they could take back. The snapped fingers, the jokes, the way they looked past someone instead of at them. The staff resumed their work, but something had shifted. Shoulders were straighter, movements more deliberate. A few guests said thank you, awkwardly, like they were learning a new language. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Sighed, the night air felt cool against Eleanor's face. She took a deep breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The estate lights glowed behind her, beautiful and distant. She didn't look back, because the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a powerful person. It's a decent one who lets others show who they truly are. She had given them that chance, not by challenging them loudly, but by standing still long enough for them to reveal themselves. That kind of power doesn't fade when the night ends. It follows people home. It sits with them in quiet moments. It asks questions they can't easily ignore. The lesson stayed behind long after she was gone. It lingered in the way the host spoke to his staff the next morning, in the way donations were reconsidered, in the way some people avoided mirrors a little longer than usual. It lived in the small, unseen choices that make up a life. Never measure a soul by how small they seem when you think they can't stand up, because the people you overlook today may be the ones deciding your fate tomorrow. And dignity, once revealed, never forgets who tried to deny it.